you that don't know me and you're new to my world, my name is Daniela. I'm self-care coach, helping you beat burnout and reconnect to yourself and honoring your nature so you can feel revived in your life and in your business. I'm so excited for today to be running this because everything that I talk about, everything that I'm about is basically comes down to this, right? Is helping women live a more free and revived life. And I think that talking about burnout is something so important right now in this, place that we are in the world, in the state of the world, because women are just getting so caught up in the everyday grind that they're really, really losing themselves and disconnecting to who they are because of the hustle, the constant hustle, the constant doing. So I guess let's begin with the number one thing that leads us to burnout. So a lot of times when we hear the word burnout, because it gets thrown around a lot nowadays, right? You hear it in so many different spaces, right? You hear, people talking about how tired they are, and, practitioners talking about, getting rid of burnout through balancing hormones. And while all this stuff is super, super important, right? All of these things that we see external manifestations of is super important. There's also so many things that lead up to this, right? There's so many underlying things that lead up to the physical representations that happen with burnout. So the one thing I really want to talk today about is the deeper stuff, the underlying stuff, regarding like why we get burnt out in the first place, right? And the reason that this happens is because essentially we forget about ourselves. We disconnect from ourselves and our nature. And because this happens, we are moving on autopilot, right? We are going through the motions and we become robotic about a lot of the things that we do, right? We constantly hear about the benefits of having habits, of building habits, and having positive rituals in our day. And all of this stuff is so important and so powerful, but we can also get lost in habits, right? Because we can get really lost in the idea that we need to do the same thing every single day, day in and day out. So it's really important that we start bringing things back to ourselves, right? Start reconnecting back to who we are, what we need, what our desires are, so that we can begin to experience less burnout in our everyday. So let's look at what's really going on behind the burnout. Okay. So, oftentimes you're waking up in the morning and you're maybe snoozing a couple of times and then immediately getting into your day, into your routine, without even giving yourself a second thought, without even acknowledging yourself, right? So it begins, usually for most women first thing in the morning, right? They're beginning disconnected from themselves, right? And from what they need, right? You also say yes to things that don't feel like a hell yes, right? You're constantly saying yes to everybody but yourself. You have a desire to please everyone, even when pleasing other people and doing all the things for other people makes you feel resentful. More often than not, you choose to, keep working instead of taking care of yourself. And, even taking a break throughout the day, right? We often have that little voice in our head that says, take a break. You've been at this a long time. You've been at the computer a long time. And we just ignore that voice. We tell that voice, yeah, but I need to keep working. I got to keep, staying in the hustle, like got to keep doing this, right? And we also do things like, we, I mean, I don't want to use the word medicate, but we use, coffee and, sugar way more than we care to admit in order to stay in that hustle mentality, right? Stay working and doing all the time, right? And one of the big things is that we have these massive expectations of ourselves to show up exactly the same every single day. And this is something that leads to a lot of frustration and a lot of chaos in our life. So, the idea that we need to be doing the same thing every single day goes against our very nature, right? And our very nature is not one that wants us to be robotic and move on autopilot, right? It wants us to connect on a daily basis to figure out, what is going on, what is it that I need today, right? So all of these things that I've mentioned, I'm going to go much deeper into as we go through this, but it's really no wonder that we are burnt out and that we are exhausted, right? Because most of what we are doing is for our external world, right? For everybody around us versus ourselves. So if we want to have, a meaningful life, a life that makes us feel like, like we're getting, we feel lit up, right? We feel alive, then we need to begin connecting more deeply to ourselves and to our nature, right? Instead of thinking that it's okay to just be in survival mode all the time, because this is essentially what's happening, right? We are going through the motions and we are, we're getting by, we're getting things done, but we are most of the time just surviving, right? So we are not only exhausted physically, right? Because that's the big thing that we think about when we think about burnout, right? We think we're physically exhausted, but we're also emotionally, spiritually, mentally exhausted, right? In all of these areas. And that is what ultimately leads to this burnout, right? And being constantly stuck in this burnout cycle, right? Because we're not one-dimensional, right? There's so many different aspects to us that don't want to be ignored, right? That's me. Yeah, it's so hard. It's so easy to get stuck in that cycle, right? So what ends up happening is that you feel the burnout and you say things to yourself like, okay, I can just make it through the week. It's just one more day. Oh, it's Wednesday. Oh, thank God it's Friday. I can relax more, right? Maybe not, because if you're an entrepreneur, you're also on all the time, right? So this is another cycle that's really easy to get stuck in, right? But you feel the grind, you feel the burnout. And so you say things to yourself like, okay, on the weekend, I'm going to take a little bit more time. I'm going to, sleep in a little bit more. And, maybe ask my partner or my parents or somebody to like watch the kids so that I can have, a little bit extra time for myself. Right. And what we don't realize is that sort of becomes part of the cycle, right? Because we just expect, right, that the weekend is going to give us enough nourishment to be able to get through another week, right? So it's almost like we're doing little things just to be able to get through another week, right? And then it becomes this constant cycle, right, that we get stuck in, right, over and over again, right? So it's really important that we, yeah, totally, right? You can totally resonate with that, right? And it's, it also, the other piece with, whether it's taking a vacation, right? And you feel really great on the vacation, but as soon as you get back on the cycle, right? we also what we do is we take the weekend to numb out, right? Or we use the evenings to numb out. So instead of using the time that we do take to do something else other than work, or just doing things for other people, we end up turning to things that help us cope with the cycle that we're going through, right? So instead of doing things that actually nourish us and make us feel good on the weekend, a lot of times we numb out, right? We'll like watch hours of Netflix, which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with Netflix, but there's a difference, right? There's a difference between, watching a show like you really love or whatever, then getting lost in that because you just don't want to deal, or you just don't want to think about everything, about the fact that you're not necessarily happy in the cycle that you're in, right? So it takes wanting to really get out of that constant survival mode, and it takes the courage to want to do the deeper work, right? To connect with yourself on a daily basis, to ask, like, why am I doing this? Why am I stuck in this? How can I do this differently, right? So burnout obviously does not get beat by just doing things sometimes, right? It's so important that we remember that consistency is everything, right? And it's not about doing monumental things every single day, because obviously that's not realistic, right? You're not going to go for a pedicure every day. You're not going to, take 2 hours in the afternoon every day. You're not going to, you're not going to spend countless hours doing things, right? Like as if you were on vacation every day. And that's not what I'm talking about, right? What I'm talking about is shifting your mindset around what it means to take care of yourself and to consider yourself throughout the day in small, meaningful ways, right? So in order to beat the burnout, we need to do a few things, right? It requires that you connect to how worthy you are of taking care of yourself. And worth is something that I feel sort of like a broken record about, because I talk about it so much. And I even ran a course called Worthy, because it is so powerful when you connect to your worth and you begin to feel worthy, right? If you don't feel worthy of taking care of yourself, if you don't feel worthy just because you are, then everything else is more worthy than you, right? Everyone else is more worthy of you. So it's really hard to get back to prioritizing yourself when you're not connected to your worth, right? So this is one piece that's really, really important to get back to and to start reconnecting with, right? It also requires that you become aware of the things that take you away from taking care of yourself. So becoming more intentional about choosing yourself in ways throughout the day. It also requires that you release yourself from certain expectations of doing the same thing day in and day out, even when your energy levels are different, when your brain chemistry feels different. And this is something I'm going to get a little bit more into when I talk about connecting to your cyclical nature. And lastly, it requires that you remember. And I use the word remember because this, right? You just have forgotten it in the context of your day because you're so busy, right? That in order to show up powerfully for the things that you want in your life, so your business, your kids, your boyfriend or your husband, or all of the things that you want out of your life, it requires that you take care of yourself, right? Otherwise, your capacity to show up for these things becomes incredibly diminished, right? And sadly, we have been conditioned and taught to live in this backwards way, right? And it's getting us by, right? We're getting by, we're making money, we're making ends meet, or we're making a lot of money, but that's not the point, right? At what cost are we doing all of these things, right? Do we want to just survive, or do we want to thrive, right? So one of the things that often happens is that, and let me know if this resonates for you, is that oftentimes we won't take care of ourselves. We won't prioritize ourselves, right, on a daily basis, because we think that, it's really hard for us to get past the idea that it's selfish or unproductive, right? And we forget that taking care of ourselves is actually goes beyond us, right? It's not just about us, right? It's so ironic that the whole reason that we don't take better care of ourselves is so that we can do more for other people, our clients, our business, everything, right? But the reality is that we can be more for those people. We can show up more powerfully if we actually take care of ourselves, right? And so we need to begin to think about the cycle, right? Like, so if you have kids, this is one thing that for me as a mom, really, when I really thought about it and I really started to connect with it, really made a big difference in terms of how I began to show up for myself. And that's the idea of breaking the cycle, right? Because the reason that we don't take care of ourselves is because we likely didn't see our mothers or our primary caregiver really take care of themselves, right? The way that they deserved, right? To really give themselves attention, right? And to not just focus about with everybody else, right? And so it's a generational thing, right? That we are then passing on to our own kids, and then they're passing on, and the cycle continues. So if we want to break that cycle, if we want to be part of breaking that cycle, then it's so important that we actually begin to prioritize ourselves, because it's not enough to tell our kids, hey, like, I don't want you to do things this way. I want you to do things better. I want you to, be successful, but also, feel that you are, joyful and motivated and loving what you're doing, and all of that stuff, right? We can't just say that, right? We have to be embodying that. We need to be living that on a daily basis, right? Because we teach by action. So this is, that's something that I wanted to throw out there, because it's so important to think about that, right? And it goes back to our worth, right? So it's also really important that we are consistent. And I talked about consistent, like I dabbled in consistency, but I want to talk a little bit more about consistency, because it's so important. Because if we are wanting to connect more deeply to our worth, right? It's almost like self-confidence, right? You don't just get self-confidence from one day to another, right? Self-confidence is something that we build, right? That is created because we're showing up on an everyday basis, right? So if we want to feel more worthy of taking care of ourselves, then we need to show up for ourselves, right? As if we feel worthy already, even if when we don't feel it. Because the more that we do it, the worthier that we feel, and the more that we keep showing up for it, right? As we see our life shift, the more that we show up. Okay, so I know I've talked a lot, but the four things that I actually really want to focus on today is 4 key principles. Okay, so what are the beliefs and habits that create burnout? 2, what are the tendencies that create burnout? And 3, how to begin to move differently in your day to avoid burnout. And lastly, and this one is one that always blows my mind talking about this with women, is connecting to your cyclical nature. You're aligning with your cycle to prevent burnout. Okay, so let's begin with what are the beliefs and mindset that leads to burnout. And I'm just going to take a sip of water because
hey, I'm going to be in the car while my daughter's, I'm going to be driving her. So is this recorded so I can watch it again and take notes?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
perfect. Okay, I'm still here. I'm listening.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
All right. So back to number one. So what are the beliefs and mindset that lead us to burnout? So the number one belief that we have all been indoctrinated in is the paradigm that you have to sacrifice yourself, rest, self-care, play, spending quality time, with friends, with kids, all that stuff. You need to sacrifice yourself to in order to be able to be successful, right? You have to be part of that hustle culture in order to be successful, right? And so it's really important that we acknowledge this, because if we believe that in order to be successful, we need to always be hustling, then we also by default believe that taking time for ourselves and resting is not going to lead us to success, right? And so this belief alone exacerbates us and keeps us in that burnout cycle, right? And along with that, it's also about thinking about what does success actually look like for you, right? Because does success actually mean for you having a lot of money and lots of things, or more money and more money and more things at any cost, right? Or is there more to success for you, right? So we see the hustle culture being represented everywhere in the media, like social media. Like you constantly see posts of like, you got to hustle, you got to hustle to make things happen, right? And while 100% we need to show up, to be able to make things happen in our life, it's a very destructive to our nature, right? And I'm going to get a little bit more about that when I speak about our cyclical nature. So the hustle culture doesn't really leave much room for us to take care of ourselves, right? And so it's time that we begin to experiment with a new paradigm, right? And this new paradigm recognizes that you don't need to sacrifice yourself in order to be successful, right? It recognizes that you can actually be more productive, more creative, more resourceful if you don't sacrifice yourself, right? It recognizes that you are a cyclical being and you need to make room to work smarter, not harder, and not necessarily do more, right? So we need to become more choosy about what we actually do, so that there's more room, right? So that we can actually do less. Okay. So, I mean, tell me, does this new paradigm not sound, way more expansive, way more, joyful than the paradigm that most of us have been living in? It does, right? So you might think, this is like not something that's achievable, right? You might think this is totally not possible for me, right? But I want to tell you that it is possible. I want you to open your eyes as I go through this training about the fact that it is possible, and that I'm going to use myself as an example. I was a gym owner and I've been an entrepreneur for about 16 years or so, maybe a little bit more. And I was totally part of that hustle culture for the majority of the time that I was an entrepreneur. It's only been, a few years, 2-3 years, that I've actually started to work differently, do things differently, see myself differently. And it has made a massive impact in my life and clients' lives that I work with. So I do know that it is possible, right? It is possible to still, be successful in the ways that you desire, and by doing less stuff, right? And that leads me to, what are the tendencies or habits that lead to burnout? Okay. So number one, for sure, hands down, is saying yes to everything and everyone, right? And along with that piece, it's being afraid to say no, right? Because if we're saying yes to everyone, we're afraid of saying no, right? And we have little or no boundaries, right? And these are things, again, that we learn from our childhood, from what we've seen, right? If we saw our mom or a primary caregiver sacrifice, herself, not really take care of herself, leave herself, to the last, give herself the scraps, and seldom do things just for herself without feeling guilty. Because I know, if your mom's been anything like mine, my mom, every time she was doing something for herself, it's like she had this guilt. She had to have this really good reason for putting herself up, her feet up, and doing something for herself, right? So this is something that we learn, right? This is something that we learn and then we begin to do ourselves, right? So we grow up with the belief that as we get older, as we take on more responsibility, as we have a career of our own, a family of our own, all the things that we need to do the same things, and we then begin to base our worth on the things that we do and we accomplish, versus feeling and remembering that we are worthy, going back to worth, because we are, right? Just because we are, without, doing anything, that is on our to-do list, right? Without sacrificing ourselves, without any of that stuff, right? And, I'm going to take it back to me for a moment, because this is something that I really struggled with at one point in my life. It was, if I didn't get, X amount of things checked off my, to-do list, I went to bed feeling like I suck. Like, why wasn't it able to do all that stuff when last week I was able to do so much more. And now I'm just not feeling it. I'm feeling more tired. I'm feeling, some of this stuff is so tedious. I didn't want to do it. And you start blaming yourself and shaming yourself and all those things. Right. So it's a cycle that we get in, and it's really difficult sometimes to see that is actually happening, right? And so, as I'm saying this, I want you to think about, do you do this in your everyday, right? Do you base your sense of worth on all the things that you do, all the things that you juggle, all the things that you accomplish? And if you happen to not be able to do them, what happens, right? Does the self-judgment, come in? And your limiting beliefs about what your worth come in, right? So in order to begin moving away from these things, right, again, we need to connect to our worthiness of that we are worthy just because we are, right? And that we don't need to be doing anything in order to feel worthy, right? And this is something that I spend 2 weeks going or working with you through in my 6-week program, From Burnout to Balance, because it's that important, right? Reconnecting to our worth so that we can release ourselves from a lot of the people pleasing, from being the yes woman to everything and everyone, right? And not having boundaries, right? And moving past some of those limiting beliefs that we grew up with, right? That we have been ingrained in us because of the way that we've grown up and the things that we've seen. So I hope this is resonating for you. So I'm going to move on to number 3. I'm just going to take another sip of my water. So let's talk next about how to move differently in your day. So oftentimes, I think women think that what I'm trying to say is that they need to, scrap a ton of things out of their life, right? In order to get rid of burnout. But the reality is that ending burnout doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing different things. Maybe you're choosing different things, but at the core, it doesn't mean that you're doing different things. It means that you're doing things differently, right? You're doing things with a different mindset around, with a different mindset, around what it means to take care of yourself on a daily basis, right? So, for example, many of us, right, deal, or have perfectionist tendencies, right? And, we feel like if we don't do the thing, that it's not going to get done right? That we need to be the ones to do it in order for it to get done right? So, the laundry is not going to get done folded properly if I don't do it. The groceries are not going to get, bought properly, or, if I ask, my boyfriend or my husband to do it, they're going to forget stuff. So it's like, this constant replay of like, I have to do it, right? So what we don't realize is that, or what we, don't connect with on an everyday basis, is that is an untrue statement, right? It may not get done the same as how we do it, but it still can get done, right? And does it have to get done the same as me, as the way that I do it? And is it wrong, right, if somebody else does it differently, right? So it's, at the end of the day, it's not worth, right? It's a question to ask yourself, right? Is it worth, not having more time for yourself and having all of this mental space being bogged down with so much stuff, right? Rather than releasing some of that stuff, right? And so where I'm going with this is that we need to start looking at our to-do list in a different way, right? So how many of the things on this list, and this is something that you can begin implementing, today, tomorrow morning, when you look at your list of the things that you have told yourself that need to happen, right? Look at it and ask these questions. So how many of these things do I actually need to say yes to? And be really, really honest with yourself, right? Because we can get caught up in thinking that we need to do certain things because guilt gets in the way. So for example, Betty's been calling me, for months, and she really wants to go out for lunch, and I really don't connect with Betty, and I really don't want to get together for lunch. And this thing stays on my to-do list, week after week after week, because I don't want to say no to her, and there's this guilt of saying no to her, right? And so it's like, how many of those kinds of things are on my list that I need to just get off my list, right? That they're taking up they're not only taking up time space, but also mental space, right? Mental capacity, right? The second one is, how many of these things can I say no to, period, right? So this is actually totally unnecessary for me to do. Like, forget it. I've got way too much on my plate. Like, I'm just not doing it, right? Like, for example, you've been asked to volunteer for your kids', I don't know, bake sale, right? And that there's there's going to be tons of other baked goods, and you feel this guilt because everybody's contributing, so do you really need to do that thing, right? And that's just an example. You might want to bake, for your kids' bake sale, but I think you get where I'm going with this, right? Next question to ask is, how many of these things can I say no to today? Because a lot of times we overestimate how much we can do in one day, right? We put so many things on our list that is so unrealistic. And I'm going to talk more about this when I talk about, aligning with your cycle, but it may be unrealistic because of where you are in your cycle, right? The amount of things that you put on there, right? So how many of the things that I have on here can actually be pushed to another day, right? And what's funny is sometimes when we put this urgency on something and we feel like it's so important, we have to get it done today, and we push it to another day, all of a sudden we see it another day and we're like, damn, that wasn't even important at all. I'm actually going to check it off altogether. Right. So we got to become really critical about the things that are on our list and become really choosy about the things that we actually want to spend our time doing. Right. And lastly, super powerful is how many of these things can I ask someone else to do and delegate? Right. Like how, like, does this actually have to be done by me? Right. Because again, we often think that if it doesn't get done by us, then it's not going to get done at all, or it's not going to get done right, And, I've given the example at home, but if you're a business owner, or even if you're a boss of some kind, or if you lead a team, if you don't know how to delegate, if you don't know how to ask people to do certain things, then you are limiting yourself, right? In what you can do in every aspect. It's not just at home, right? So we need to really become critical about the things on our list, right? Which obviously takes a lot of practice, right? Because if you've been living in the cycle for a long time, right, it does require practice, right? It does require patience, and it does require that you be consistent with it, right? And the more consistent you are, the better you'll become at looking at those things on the list and deciding this is not important right now, right? This can be taken off, right? And the amount of mental headspace that opens up when you begin to do less of the stuff that you don't need to do, that you don't want to do, right? That doesn't serve you in any way is massive, right? Mental space to allow you to show up more powerfully in every aspect of your life, right? With your clients, in your work, with your kids, being more present with them, with your husband or your boyfriend, right? With your friends, with your parents, right? So it just opens up this whole new all this new time, right? Which we thought didn't exist, right? And part of why we're stuck in that burnout cycle, right? It opens up all of this time, right? That was there in the first place. We just didn't see it, right? We just shifted our perspective around time and we became more choosy, right? So, obviously it opens up a lot more space for more joy and more focus and, being able to have more energy in our life and in our day, right? So I hope that that's, connecting for you. And you're feeling like, a lot of the stuff that I'm saying is something that, that you're, currently working through, that you feel like, damn, this is something that I have been doing, right? That that I really need to, think about, right? That I really have been just doing everything on my list and not thinking twice, right? Because, awareness is so important, right? Because we know, I mean, a lot of the things that I'm telling you, I'm sure that right? You've heard before, right? But we forget in the context of our day because our day is so busy, right? And we are constantly moving on autopilot, right? And that brings me to, the fourth principle that I wanted to talk about, which is connecting to your cyclical nature, aligning with your cycle to avoid burnout. And honestly, this has become one of my favorite things to talk about because it's so powerful. And at the same time, it's so simple. And it blows my mind. It blows my mind when I think about the fact that I never knew this growing up, that my mom didn't sit me down and tell me about this, that a book was never given to me around connecting to my cycle. It just completely blows my mind, right? And when I first read a book about, I think it was Alisa Vitti, In the Flow, that I read, I was like, whoa, seriously, like I couldn't believe that I never knew any of this stuff, right? And that's likely the same for you, right? You may have never ever been told anything about your cycle other than, you bleed and that you get cramps, before it. And often, you experience PMS, you get into a really bad mood, things like that. And, if, like, I had a little bit of a celebration in terms of like, oh no, now you're a woman and you can have kids if, in the future, if you want to, and that kind of stuff. But it was like generally a negative kind of light around having a period. It kind of sucks to be a woman, you have to bleed and, not feel that great once a month. And, you got to wear a pad, which is so annoying, or a tampon and all that stuff. So it's almost like this negativity around our cycle versus us being taught that it's this like incredible thing that is part of us, that is part of our nature, that we can tap into, that actually makes us more powerful. So one of the things that I think is so powerful when it comes to aligning with our cycle is that so many of us deal with self-judgment, right? Around getting certain things done, around being productive, right? Around always doing things, right? And when, and this goes back to what I talked before about, connecting our worth to the things that we do, not feeling worthy because we are. So, we feel the self-judgment because sometimes we're able to feel like we're doing it all, right? Like sometimes we're just on, like we are focused at work. We're like doing a million things, kids ask us to do something and we're doing it. And our husband asked this and we're doing it. And we're just doing all the things, right? And we're also, working out and like, eat healthy. We're like just doing it all, right? We just managed to do it all and it feels so good. And then suddenly we can't manage doing it all anymore the same. We feel dragged down, we feel more tired, right? And so there's this self-judgment of like, why am I feeling burnt out? Why am I not able to do the same stuff that I did last week, right? Well, the reason that we are not able to do the same things we did last week is because we, number one, probably did way too much, right? And now we are in a different phase of our cycle, right? Our body naturally is built, right? If we listen, right? If we listen to our nature, we are built to not get into burnout, right? If we respect our cyclical nature, right? And so I want you, that might be a little bit vague for you. So I'm going to explain a little bit more what I mean. So I want you to think about your cycle as the seasons of the year, right? So we've got, spring, summer, fall, winter, right? And with each season, there is something very different that happens in each season, right? And I love connecting our cycle to the seasons because they're very much connected, very, very much connected. We are very much connected to our universe, our nature, right? And so, we have, right, these internal seasons, right, that we go through every single month, right? So our cycle is divided into 4 parts, just like the cycles, right? We have our follicular phase, which is our inner spring. We have our ovulatory phase, which is our inner summer. We have our luteal phase, which is our inner fall. And we have our menstrual phase, which is our inner winter, right? And as each one of these phases shifts, as we move through these phases, right, there is a lot of change that happens within us, right? I mean, obviously there's lots happening, right? Inside of our body, right? But emotionally, we are shifting. Our brain chemistry is shifting, right? Our energy levels are shifting. our creativity is shifting. So the things that we are like, our strengths shift throughout our cycle, right? And the more that we resist it, right, the more external chaos that we experience, right? Because we are not because we're not connected, right, to what is actually going inside, what is actually going on inside, right? So it's this constant it's this constant struggle that is happening between the external world and our own internal world that is happening, right? So I want you to imagine for a moment, and if you can close your eyes, this will be, even more powerful. So I want you to actually think about spring for a moment, right? And we're going through spring right now in Canada, so it's going to be even easier for you to visualize this, right? So think about, what is the energy of spring, right? What is that energy going on right now, right? It's this energy of rebirth, right? It's flirty, it's social, it's bubbly, it's alive with energy, right? New energy that we didn't have in the winter, right? You're seeing everybody come out, come alive, right? Again, after the thaw, right? Little seedlings are sprouting, right? And as obviously, as the spring keeps evolving, there's more that's happening, right? More that's coming alive, right? And that's exactly what's happening inside our body, right? We are coming alive after winter, our inner winter, which is our menstrual phase, right? And so this is an amazing time to start new things, right? Think back, rebirth, right? And getting out of our comfort zone, right? Getting things done, being creative, being assertive, being out there, right? That feels so good in our inner spring, right? And that that energy keeps building, right? It keeps building as we get into summer, right? The same way that we see it externally in the seasons, it keeps building, right? So the momentum that starts to build in spring keeps going in summer, right? And so think about that energy of summer. Again, keep those eyes closed or close them again if you haven't, and think about the inner summer, right? Think about summer and how turned on you are, right? How alive you feel, right? Everything feels exciting. You have so much energy, right? And so this is a great time for, again, keep doing new things, keep putting yourself out there, being really social, like even if you're an introvert like me, during this season, you crave being with people more, right? And you get more from it, right? It's not depleting as it would be in other seasons, right? It's also, a time that we are really good at, speaking, right? So if we have speaking engagements, right, it's like a perfect time to show up for that because our brain chemistry is optimal for that, right? It's also a time that you feel your sexiest, right? So it's like, going out on dates and doing, all that fun stuff, right? It's also like a great time for play, right? And being active, spending time outdoors, all of that good stuff, right? So, as I'm talking here, I want you to think about the simplicity of this, right? That it's actually built in within us, and it's actually so simple if we begin to think of our cycle in terms of the cycles or the seasons, right? And how they also cycle, right? And how there's a purpose. There's a purpose to each one of the seasons, right? Because one builds upon the other, builds upon the other, builds upon the other, and we are able to go through a constant cycle of, a mini death and a rebirth, right? Which is exactly what's happening inside our body, right? So let's move on to fall, okay? So again, think about what fall means, right? When fall comes, you start to put on the layers, the sweaters come on, you start to take out your blankets again. You're drinking, warmer, teas and, all that kind of stuff again, after not really craving any of that stuff in summer, right? And so we begin as well to turn inwards, right? Just like fall does, right? So we're almost like shedding layers, right? We begin to shed some of those layers, right? And so it's a really great time to organize, right? To start finishing things off that you were in the creative energy in the first two phases, right? And so now you've created all this stuff. Now it's time to close things off, right? To finish things off, right? And to start allowing yourself a little bit more rest, right? And as I'm talking about fall and winter, you're going to notice that these are the two seasons where it is most critical that you have worked on being able to say no, being able to ask for help, setting boundaries, right? Because in the first two seasons of our cycle, right, it's almost like we can do it all, right? We feel like I don't need help, I'm good, I got it, right? But in the fall and the winter, that's not the case, right? We need to start really respecting those boundaries, right? Really, saying no to those things that don't serve us, because otherwise it leads to burnout, right? We feel more depleted, right? If we keep trying to stay in the first and second cycle, right, in the spring and the summer, if we keep doing that, that's what's leading us to burnout. It's not respecting that we need to start working differently now, right? That we need to start, turning inwards a little bit more, right? And then, of course, we lead into winter, right? So for me, winter, I even though we as humans don't hibernate, hibernation is like the first thing that comes to mind, especially because, I live in Canada. And I sometimes wish that I could hibernate because I'm so not a winter person. And I almost wish like I was a polar bear and I could just come into my little cave and come out again when it's spring, right? But the reality is that we are not bears and we don't hibernate. However, it is that hibernation mode that we need to start thinking about, right? When we come into our inner winter, right? During this time, rest is considered productive. And I'm going to tell you why, right? It's because if you don't rest, if you don't allow yourself the rest now, then you're not going to feel the beauty of spring and summer, right? And this is where women begin to experience hormonal issues, they lose their periods, all that stuff, because we are constantly trying to work in the same phase, right? All the time. So rest is productive during this phase, right? Slowing down is productive during this phase. And I'm not saying that it's realistic to take, 3-4 days off, or even if your menstruation is longer, totally off so you can rest. I'm not saying that because that's not always possible. And hopefully on your first day of your bleed, you can take a few hours for yourself. You can take a bit more time for yourself, to journal, to really connect, right? Because this is a time where our intuition is at its peak, right? So it's really, really important that we slow down. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to listen to what our intuition is telling us, right? What our inner guides are telling us. We're not going to be able to hear that over the noise of all of the things, right? And if we're moving at warp speed, right? So if you can't take the full day off, right? It's about slowing down, thinking of yourself as a sloth, right? A sloth that is doing everything at a slower pace. And to use this time to not be in the energy of spring and summer where we're putting ourselves out there all the time and, doing speaking engagements and all of these things. I'm not saying not to do any of them because, I'm currently in my luteal phase, right? And I'm here with you, right? But it's about, limiting yourself as much as to an extent that feels good, right? So whereas in the summer and the spring and summer, it may have felt really good to, get on Zoom or, have like, 10 conversations. And now you only really have the bandwidth to get, for 2 hours of that, right? The capacity changes, right? So using this time more to be more productive in terms of course correction, right? So, this is a time where the right and the left hemisphere of the brain are working very powerfully together, right? So it's a really great time. Again, this goes back to our intuition to course correct. So what do I need to change in my business? Or, what are some changes that need to be implemented in the way that I work, right? That I can begin implementing in the spring and the summer, right? What are those things that I need to kind of close off, right? So that I can begin spring in this new energetic place, right? Versus not even feeling spring, right? Because if we don't take the time to connect to our nature, right, in our fall and winter, and to honor what is actually happening in our body, because there's a lot of physical things that are happening, right? It's a big deal. Then we are not going to experience our spring and our summer the way that we desire, right? And and you're going to lose a lot of the beauty of what it is to align, to sync with your cycle, right? So the winter it's critical, right? It's critical that we become really good at delegating, saying no, and to also be open about where we are with the people that are closest to us, right? So this is one thing that was super life-changing for me, was to talk openly about where I am in my cycle, right? With my husband, right? And even my son, like I'll openly say, I'm on my period. I really just need to be alone. Can you please leave me? Like we usually, spend some time at night, cuddling and reading or like watching something or whatever. And during my period, I just don't have the first day of my period. I just don't have the bandwidth for that, and a lot of times I'll be like, what, I just really need an hour to myself before I go to bed. Right. So it's about being honest, right? So that, the people that we're closest with are not, number one, feeling like we're pushing them away, right? For no reason at all, right? And that they start to understand where we're at, right? Because if we don't have those boundaries, if we say yes to everything, what it leads to is a shitload of resentment, right? A shitload of resentment, and also breaking down and losing your shit on the people that you don't want to lose your shit on, right? Losing your patience with the fact that nobody is picking up their socks, and I do everything and nobody does anything around the house and all that stuff, right? That all comes out in the luteal and the menstrual phase, right? And it can get minimized. It gets minimized, right? When you begin to respect yourself, and when you begin to share where you are in your cycle, and to also, more so than that, to express what your actual needs are, right? What are your needs, right? And this is powerful, not, to share not only with your partner, but also your kids, because this becomes now something that they begin to do, right? They begin to connect more with what they need, right? And I have a son, I don't have a daughter. So, my son doesn't experience a bleed, right? But, boys still experience, needs, right? They still have needs that they need to connect with, right? And one thing I didn't mention is, cycle syncing is powerful, whether you are on the pill or not. So if you're on the pill, you're not experiencing a true period, right? Even if, because you're not ovulating, right? So even if you are on the pill, it's super powerful to still cycle sync, because it allows you to get out of that burnout phase, right? To naturally, align more to what is going on inside your body and how you're feeling, right? And while you might not experience, the summer, the internal summer, the same, you're still cyclical, right? And if you're no longer menstruating, right, syncing with the moon cycles, because we are very much connected to the moon. And a lot of women, in menopause, or if for whatever reason you're no longer menstruating, find it really powerful to connect with the moon energy, right? So, whether we're bleeding or not, we are cyclical, right? And this cycle is a built-in way for us to prevent burnout, right? And obviously there's so many layers here, right? There's so many layers in terms of our connecting to our cycle. But what I really wanted to do today was to help you see the simplicity, right? Because a lot of times women feel like, oh God, it's just another thing that I have to do, right? So it's almost like, oh God, I'm adding more stress to my life. Now I got a cycle sync, right? And no, it's not about adding more stress to your life. It's not about adding one more thing. It is actually really simple, right? And I wanted to help you see it in the way of the seasons, because when we think of it that way, it becomes a lot more simple, right? And we begin to see that when we go against our nature, there is chaos, right? We are essentially making things harder. Things that don't need to be harder, we are making harder, right? So, it's almost like thinking about, winter, right? The winter months, and winter being really mad that there's no flowers blooming, and, summer being really mad that the trees are not turning colors, right? So it's like every time we have an expectation outside of what is actually in our nature, there is this forcing energy, right? This like constant need to force yourself to do something, right? And one thing that I didn't talk about was the exercise and the food piece, the nutrition piece, which I'll talk about, briefly, because, for years I worked as a personal trainer and as a holistic lifestyle coach. So I did a lot of, nutrition work with women. And so I want to, this is a really important piece, right? That goes back to moving on autopilot, right? So a lot of times you might be doing a lot of self-care, that what you feel is self-care, right? So you're doing the workout and you're eating really clean, really healthy food, right? And, or you're dabbling in this, either way, right? And so that can also become very robotic and very autopilot, right? And the reason for that is that our body requires something different in each phase, right? And so, for example, if we feel like we need to do 4 HIIT sessions a week and, 3 strength training sessions, I'm just giving you an example, and do cardio twice a week or whatever. We have this like routine that we need to do in order to feel like, I'm moving towards this goal that I have, right? I want to reach this goal of like being a certain size, or, getting to this certain weight, or feeling better in my body, whatever the goal is, right? And so we can get stuck in that thinking of that it has to be the same all the time, right? But when we are still choosing to do that amount of workouts, right, or that style of workout in our luteal phase, or even as we, more importantly, as we approach our menstrual phase, right? So maybe the second week of our luteal phase, it depletes us. It doesn't give us the same thing that it gave us when we did it in the summer and in the spring and in the summer, right? It didn't boost endorphins like it normally does. It actually, I felt like I did too much. It actually almost made me feel tired a few hours later, right? And I don't experience that, in the spring and summer. So like, why is that? But you keep pushing yourself to do it because it's on your to-do list and it's the habit that you've set for yourself, right? And so that goes back to connecting, right? The first thing that I talked about is reconnecting to what you actually need, right? And what you actually desire, right? Because if we have to force ourselves to do that HIIT workout in our luteal phase, number one, are we really getting what we need from that workout, right? And is it making our life better, right? So it is always better, right, to connect with what is it that I actually need? What is it that my body needs today, right? And I'm not saying don't move. I move every day. It's seldom like I have to be sick to not move my body, right? But the way that I now move my body is totally different than I moved my body 3 years ago, right? I used to do the same workouts all the time, all the time, all the time. And especially as I got older, not that I'm old, but I'm now 44. And so your body changes, right? Your cycle also changes, right? And how your cycle impacts your body also changes. A lot of things change, right? And so, the reason that I turned to cycle syncing was, number one, for myself, because I saw like something's off here, like this doesn't feel good anymore. And I want it to feel good, right? And seeing countless clients, female clients going through the same thing and constantly being in this forcing energy at certain times in their cycle and wondering, how come I'm not as strong now? And there's this judgment, right? I'm not as strong. I can't do this as fast. I can't lift as much, all this stuff, right? When in reality, there should be no judgment around that, because we are supposed to be doing something different. And I mean, not supposed to. Again, it goes back to connecting. What is it that my body is craving today, right? And the same thing is for food, right? So like if you think about, again, going back to the seasons, right? If you think about what you eat and what you crave, right? And I don't mean necessarily shitty food, but in the winter, we crave comfort food, right? That can be like a soup or a stew, right? Warming, comforting soups, And, I know for me in the winter, having a cold smoothie makes me feel cold, right? Like I don't want the same thing, right? I'd rather have overnight oats, or I make my smoothies differently. I don't use frozen fruit anymore. So it's about, respecting, right? What do I now need, right? And changing the way that we eat and not being so caught up on like eating a certain way and eating a certain amount of calories or eating within a certain amount of macros so that we can get to a certain goal, because all of this stuff is leading us to burnout, right? It's exacerbating that constant cycle, right? And, in our, so for so many years, I felt, there was always a period of time throughout the month where I was like so hungry and I couldn't explain why I was so hungry all the time, right? And once I discovered, my cycle and started to, research that and explore that, I realized, oh my God, like I actually need more food during this time, right? So it took so much of the guilt off, right? Of feeling hungry or during that time, right? And so it's all about connecting, right? Being willing to connect with yourself in small ways on a daily basis, right? And going back to remembering that you get to show up more powerfully in every single thing that you do when you connect more deeply with yourself, when you see yourself as the worthy woman that you are, right? Worthy of taking care of yourself, right? Worthy of nourishing yourself, worthy of moving in ways that feel good, worthy of saying no to things that don't serve you, that don't make you feel good, right? And saying yes to things that feel really exciting and that you want to do, right? And having freaking boundaries, right? You don't have to be there for everything, right? You don't have to be open for everything all the time, not even for your kids, because what are you teaching them, right? And you're also taking away some of their power, right? We take away other people's power, and this can be at home, whether you have kids or in, your business or in your work, right? Every time we feel like we're the only ones that can do this thing, right? We are taking other people's power away from doing those things for themselves, from learning, right? From learning from their mistakes, from learning to do things better, from having the satisfaction of doing those things for themselves and being like, damn, like I took that off her plate. It feels really good, right? And this is why we hire assistants, right? This is why this is how things work, right? Things don't work when we try to do them all ourselves. Things don't work in any way the way that we want them to when we try to do it all, right? And we are just bogging ourselves down. We are literally making our things harder, right? And do you want to make things harder? I'm sure you don't, right? I'm sure that you want to make things easier for yourself, right? Rather than harder, right? Would I be right? Yeah. So all of the stuff that I've talked about requires more integration, right? Deeper work that we can't do in a 1 hour masterclass or a little over an hour masterclass, right? So I'm inviting you to go deeper with me on all of these things, right? I'm inviting you to join my 6-week program, from burnout to balance, where we're going to dive deeper with all of these things, right? Go deeper in connecting to your cyclical nature, so that you can work smarter, not harder, not do less things and not more things, right? Connect more deeply to your worth, because the way I see it, that is sort of like the basis for everything, right? If we truly believe that we are worthy, then everything else, taking care of ourselves becomes easier, right? And there's less resistance around taking care of ourselves, right? We're also going to, help you recode limiting beliefs around, people pleasing and having to say yes to everyone all the time, and, setting, boundaries, sacred boundaries for our life, so that we can have more freedom, right? Because I think we all want more freedom, right? More time freedom, right? To open more up in our lives, right? So this 6-week program includes weekly coaching with me, as well as once a week Voxer coaching, which is a walkie-talkie coaching. If you've never done, Voxer coaching, it's basically like, a coach in your back pocket. So as things come up, I'm able to support you through that, between our coaching sessions. And this is a group program that is going to begin in 2 weeks. The cost is $1,222 for 6 weeks. So if you're ready to go deeper with that, I will send you a link. I'm going to send you a link, after this, if you'd like to join me there. And if you have, questions,